Indira Gandhi famously asked the astronaut Rakesh Sharma how India looked from outer space. He had remarked, Sare jahan se acha. But how does India get perceived and written about by writers who are not Indians and who are based outside this country? To discuss this interesting topic, we have two very eminent people, Mr. Ian Jack and Mr. Sunil Sethi. Mr. Ian Jack is a British journalist who was the editor of the literary magazine Granta from 1995 to 2007. He began his career on newspaper in Scotland in the 1960s and has then moved to the Sunday Times from 1970 to 1986, working as a reporter, editor, feature writer, and foreign correspondent in India, from where he covered the Indian subcontinent and regional hotspots, including Afghanistan. Between 1977 and 1989, he lived off Calcutta and New Delhi. He was a co-founder of The Independent on Sunday in 1989 and edited the paper from 1991 to 1996. A contributor to The Guardian for many years, Jack currently writes a weekly column and other articles for the newspaper. He was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society of Literature in 2009. Mr. Jack will be in conversation with Mr. Sunil Sethi. Mr. Sunil Sethi is a journalist, columnist, and television presenter. He has hosted the weekly literary show Just Books on NDTV since early 2005. He was one of the founding editorial team members of India Today and has worked for the Hindustan Times. He has been a columnist for the Times of India and the Indian Express. His journalism has appeared in The Economist, The Boston Globe, and several international publications. He has scripted and presented documentaries for the BBC and Channel 4. He is also a recipient of the Nieman Fellowship at Harvard University and the Japan Foundation Fellowship. I request the panelists to now proceed with the session. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear us? Why don't people at the back move up front? Why don't you all come up front? Lots of spare seats here.
We'll feel better if you do.
And more shade too. It's a very, very great privilege for me to be introducing or in conversation with Ian Jack, one of Britain's most distinguished editors and journalists, who also happens to be a very old and dear friend. Ian Jack's written many books. You've heard something about his remarkable career, but certainly one of the most important aspects of his writing has been India. It's his collection of over 35 years of writings on India in a variety of publications has just been put out in this wonderful volume called Mufassal Junction, 1977, 212 Indian Encounters. The subject today is India from the outside, which I think is another way of saying outsiders writing about India or how they view India. In the context of recent discussions here, this seems to me a question that's both intriguing and a little bit irritating. Firstly, because I don't know what they mean by foreigners writing about India, because in my opinion, a lot of Indians are foreigners in their own country. Also because in the context of the current debate about who gets to write about India, whether it's outsiders writing about India, whether it's Indian language writers writing in English, indeed diaspora writers, Indians settled abroad writing about India, the question gets unnecessarily argumentative and I think very limiting. The simple answer is that everyone should have a chance at writing about India. That's the way it's been in thousands of years of this country's history. What would we be without the great records of outsiders like Chinese monks, Fa Hin or Hyun Sang, or the Arab traveler Ibn Battuta, and their records of India. And I'm not sure how many Indians are completely at home or well acquainted with India. A couple of months ago, I was at one of those boring diplomatic cocktail parties in London, I think at the Indian Deputy High Commissioner's house, one of those things that journalists have to attend. And I was talking to an Indian waiter passing around the drinks. I got talking to him and I said, "So where are you from?" "Sir, I'm from district Ernakulam in Kerala." "How long have you been here?" I asked him. He said, "Sir, about 4 years. But he said, "I've worked abroad for a long time." So I said, "Oh, really? Where were you before this?" And he said, "New Delhi." So, Ian, your original arrival in India, I don't know how much of an outsider you felt, but it was almost accidental. Your engagement and later, if I may say so, immersion in India was a sort of had a flukish beginning.
Yes, it was an entire fluke. Nobody could have been more ignorant than I was about India when I came here in 1976. And I came here really because I was interested in Indian steam engines, which is a kind of sad little interest, which I followed for many years, and I wanted to write about them. And I had a commission to write about those and to write about eye hospitals in UP near Lucknow from the Sunday Times magazine. And so I arrived in Delhi in December 1976, knowing very little about India. And what I always remember, actually, from those first few days was the smell of camphor balls and joss sticks in every hotel lobby. A smell, I think, that's kind of disappeared now, hasn't it, as hotels have got rather grander. And the cold light in Delhi in December, which was rather lovely, and not knowing anybody and not knowing what to expect and being extremely apprehensive and actually taking ridiculous precautions, because the thing that worried people in those days, from Britain anyway, was that you would get some terrible stomach upset. So you would bring with you potassium permanganate to wash your fruit in, and water purification tablets to put into your cups of tea. Both ineffectual, I would have thought, but also completely unnecessary. So for a long time, I did this, even behind people's backs, in people's houses. When they said, "Have a cup of tea," I would surreptitiously put a little thing in.
The important thing about your arrival in India in late 76, early 77 was that it was a moment of political tumult in Delhi. The emergency, Indira Gandhi's emergency, was coming to a close, and elections of 1977 either had or were just about to be announced. The country had fallen silent under her draconian rule, and suddenly, from being a feature writer at the Sunday Times, you really turned out to be a star political foreign correspondent. To what extent was it because you were there in the right place at the right time?
Well, it's nice of you to say that, Sunil. I think I was a pretty inexpert foreign correspondent to begin with. I was simply in India when Mrs. Gandhi called these elections, and the paper very kindly said, would I carry on being in India? And that really changed my life in all kinds of ways, personal as well as professional. But I began like a kind of, I didn't know what I was doing really. I mean, I was lucky to have met you. I was lucky to have met your friends. I was lucky to be taken to villages outside Delhi and introduced to the Indian countryside. And I was lucky, so lucky, that at that moment in Indian political history, there was a sudden kind of effervescence and tremendous kind of upthrust of popular politics, because the emergency had been declared to be an end. And a kind of terrible, for instance, Morarji Desai asked me to share his car for half a day when he was campaigning in UP. And contrary to the idea that journalism is a brave profession, it can sometimes be, in my case, quite a cowardly one. The one thing I knew about Morarji Desai was that he was thought to drink his own urine. The question that I should therefore have asked him was, "Sir, do you drink your own urine?" I couldn't bring myself to do this. I talked about the price of gold. I talked about politics in the Gangetic Plain. I talked about his son. I talked about Gandhi. I talked about the iniquitous Mrs. Gandhi, who he hated. But I couldn't bring myself to ask that question. And of course, it was Simon Winchester, a rival correspondent, who did ask the question and got a glorious, open assent. "Yes," he said, "I do drink my own urine. So what?" Which led to Winchester's famous remark that the Indian Prime Minister's kidneys had a sense of déjà vu. But I didn't ask the question. And later, I went to see Maraji in Mumbai, in Bombay, some years later, and my goodness, did he look wonderfully healthy. He was then in his late 80s, and he looked marvelous. Now, this is a great thing, this urine drinking.
Yes, I mean, glowing and strong as a horse.
And also, just a little footnote, a lot of people in Britain imagine that urine drinking is some kind of Indian habit. Far from it. An eccentric Victorian Englishman who wrote a book on the subject, which, like a lot of eccentric Victorianisms, was picked up in India somehow. And Sarah Miles, God bless her, I think I can mention it also, she's the only other person, the actress Sarah Miles, is the only other urine drinker who's kind of come out about it.
Your hesitation in popping this simple question to Morarji Desai didn't keep you out of trouble in India, did it? Because one of the hazards of being a foreign correspondent, at least in that terrible phase of xenophobia that India was going through in the late 70s, a time of terrible tumult and turbulence, was the mantra, the ruling mantra of the Congress Party was chuck them out, and you were chucked out.
Yes, I was. This is a shame. I hope we got all the shame over quickly here, because I want to move on to less shameful things. But I made a mistake. It was this, and I've written about it in this book. It did lead me to leave the country very quickly. I was doing a piece on Sanjay Gandhi. I followed him around Lucknow and Raebareli, and maybe even Amethi, I can't remember then. It was a profile of Sanjay Gandhi. And
controversial subject.
A controversial subject. And I went to a party one night in somebody's house, this person's house, and there I met a woman who said, "Do you know what they're saying in Calcutta? They're saying the mother is sleeping with the son." So when I came to write the piece, I was trying to explain how gossip and rumor played a kind of part in a society where the free press had largely disappeared for 15 months. So I said that many people had tried to explain Sanjay's hold over his mother, and there were several theories, the most ludicrous of which were blackmail and incest. Now, this was a very, very silly thing to write. I'm the first person to agree with that, if anybody else thinks it. But it got into the paper. It not only got into the paper, but when the Indian High Commissioner summoned the editor of the Sunday Times to his office and summoned somebody from the Foreign and Commonwealth Office of Britain, then met the Indian High Commissioner, who was B.K. Nehru, a branch of the family, it was decided I should be withdrawn because my life might be endangered by, presumably, Congress supporters. How true any of this was, I don't know. But the Sunday Times, poor souls, having printed it, then repeated the offence the next week by saying that anybody who read this paragraph couldn't possibly misunderstand it. You know, clearly I did not believe in the incest theory, and which upset them even more. As somebody once said in the Sunday Times, we added incest to injury. Anyway, this is not a glorious story at all. I'm really ashamed of it. I mean, it was poor behavior on my part. I then got a flight to Karachi from Delhi. It was all very dramatic and romantic even for a young man like me. But in Karachi, in Pakistan, then I had to go around denying this fact as a truth. Because everybody in Pakistan, of course, desperately wanted to believe it to be true. So I was often interviewed, and every time I had to say, no, it's not true, I don't believe it. So my heroism in Pakistan lasted for about 2 days.
And now we are letting you into the secret lives of journalists, old colleagues and friends, Purana puppies. And I remember trying to extricate Ian to return to India from Palam Airport. Delhi still had a fairly small airport, and of course I think he was finally shipped back to London. And the other day, I was going through an old file of our old correspondence, and I do have a letter as evidence to this silly, ludicrous story, the kind of mistakes and the perils of journalism, in which Ian is writing to me and saying, you know, I think we'll now meet as old men in India, which we today are. From those early, almost dangerous political encounters in India, any other correspondent or reporter would have been so disheartened and possibly never wanted to return to this strange place again. What made you persist? Why did you come back? What was the lure, the attraction of India? Because it never stopped, did it?
No, it's never stopped. Well, I'm very suspicious of people who say they love India. It seems too complicated a thing to love. Nonetheless, people do say it. I like being here very much, and I always have done. I think it's a combination of things, I suppose. One thing is it's a very, very easy country to be a journalist in. I can't speak about people who work here as journalists, but certainly for a foreign journalist, it's a very easy country to be in. It's very free, people are very nice to you, and they're very polite, and they answer your questions. It's a kind of wonderful country to be curious in. I'm quite a curious person in the sense of wanting to find things out. And there's so much to be curious about in India. You can never kind of fill up this thing called your curiosity. You keep on being curious. The other thing was that I met a woman here and we got married. She was from Bengal. We're no longer married, but that clearly was another bond with it. It's a difficult... I mean, there's something in the kind of atmosphere of India. I'm not flattering the audience when I say this. I don't mean to anyway. That's very conducive to people who come from somewhere else. Perhaps especially Britain or perhaps especially Europe, I don't know. But there's something about the way people deal with each other here that is interesting and seductive.
Your other distinguished fellow Scotsman, Alexander Mccall Smith, the great novelist and thriller writer, who's actually in private life a professor of medical ethics and medical law, once said to me that I knew that he was a diehard fan of R.K. Narayan, for example, and had written this brilliant piece once saying that the Nobel Prize, in his opinion, should have gone to one great writer, and that was R.K. Narayan, who comes from this part of the country, Mysore. And I asked Alexander once, why do you keep returning to India? And he said exactly what Ian has just said, but in a very simpler, different way. He said, the reason I can't do without India is because I can't do without the conversations I have here. They're like conversations I have nowhere else. Which takes me to this collection of nearly 50 pieces written over 40 years of reporting and chronicling life in India. Long articles, some of them, especially set in the Mufassal. All of you know what the Mufassal means, but it's the old word for anything that's outside the cities, in the districts, in the hinterland. And two of the most amazing stories here that Ian Jack wrote concern the Indo-British colonial encounter. One is his search for the birthplace of George Orwell, the great socialist and satirist, 1984, Animal Farm. George Orwell was born in Motihari in Bihar. I let Ian tell you the story. How a journalist can unlayer layers and layers of great history.
Well, I went to Motihari in 1983. Motihari is in North Bihar. You used to get there by crossing the Ganges by steamer, but they just built the bridge at that time. It's a district town. I went there wondering if I could find any evidence of Orwell's birthplace. Because Orwell's father, Richard Blair, was an opium revenue inspector, a very lowly bit of the Indian civil service, and not much respected by other members of the Indian civil service. Anyway, I got to Motihari, and I thought I'm going to see the district collector, I suppose, and he had heard of Orwell. That was a big start. But there was no record of any house or where the Orwell had lived. So then he put me in touch with a kind of great succession of very helpful people who didn't know anything about Orwell, had never heard of Orwell.
And who were inevitably called Tiwari.
They were all called Tiwari, yes, very confusingly called Tiwari. And I did explain to one, I said, well, he wrote a book called 1984. And this Mr. Tiwari said, he wrote a book about next year? And I said, yes, it was a book about next year. And I spent the night in his house. He brought out little bits of scraps of paper and books and old Imperial Gazetteer volumes. He was very helpful. And then we thought we'd identified where Orwell's family had lived, which was I should have known better really, even then. It was a kind of, it wasn't a bungalow. Most of Motihari disappeared in the Great Bihar earthquake. But it was near a go-down. The go-down had collected opium, had stored opium. This was next to the go-down, so possibly some kind of civil servant had lived in it. Didn't seem very likely because it was very small. Anyway, this piece appeared. I wrote it for a Sunday magazine in Calcutta. The piece appeared, and within some years, it became an established fact that this humble building was where George Orwell was born. And indeed, there's a sign there now that says, George Orwell born here. But as far as I know, that's probably not true.
Ian spent a long time looking for another very interesting British character who really changed, in my opinion, the history of Indian language. There's been so much talk here about translation and Indian languages versus English, and English is this kind of octopus whose tentacles are driving out writing in Indian languages. But this man was William Carey, the Baptist missionary in the late 18th, 19th century. Tell us about him. And Serampore.
I got interested in William Carey for a very odd reason, I suppose. I got interested because I was writing a book, which I never in fact wrote, but it was about the history of the steam engine, not necessarily the steam locomotive, but the steam engine in 19th century India. And William Carey, who was a Baptist missionary who went to Serampore on the Hooghly, was in Victorian Christian biographies always said to be the man who imported the first steam engine to India to be used as a way of moving the machinery that printed Bibles. I don't know to this day whether he was the first man or not. Anyway, I went to Serampore to have a look round. Serampore is a very interesting place. It's where they established a college in the 19th century, and which still exists. It's a wonderful kind of classical Greek building. Anyway, Carey was the son of a cobbler. In fact, he was a cobbler himself. He was an illiterate, uneducated person who largely self-taught person, who came to Serampore to convert people to Christianity, which he was hopeless at, and really hopeless. He used to say to Brahmins that they couldn't be Brahmins because Noah wasn't a Brahmin, and there were no human beings in the world who were not descended from Noah. Well, any Brahmin would have seen off that argument pretty quickly. So there was no joy there in terms of conversions. However, he then became an indigo, he worked an indigo plant. Indigo had then become, in the late 18th century, a very important plant in India because the dye was used for military uniforms. Europe was awash with wars, French wars, English wars, wars in the Caribbean, and Haiti in the Caribbean, which had been the principal source of indigo up to this point, had been overtaken by the famous slaves' revolt. So they couldn't get indigo from there, so the new supply became Bihar. So he worked in this indigo plant, and indigo requires gallons and gallons and gallons of fresh water. So they had to be plants located near the Himalayas. And then he came back to Serampore. His wife died. All kinds of the most terrible things happened to Carey. Deaths and disease and illness. And he married a Danish widow. Now, Serampore was important because it was a Danish colony. The Danes had a colony on the Hooghly in those days. And it was therefore out with the remit of the British at Fort William in Calcutta. Because the British disapproved of missionary activity as interfering with the local population, who weren't to be interfered with. Their beliefs weren't to be interfered with. So he set up house there, and he became the most amazingly interesting person in the sense that he translated lots of documents from English into Indian languages. He cut the fonts typographically, cut typographic fonts, and he created alphabets for several Indian languages. And he was a great botanist, and he was a great collector. And he did actually import a steam engine. But I spent a lot of time there living with Baptists who'd come from Canada in a strange hostel. And it was quite strange to live among Christians in India and to hear sometimes their inadequacies as converters of the local population. It hadn't been a big success.
Right, but why the Serampore story is very exciting here is not only because this crazy, inadvertent genius called William Carey, who translated, by creating these typefaces and importing, it said, the first printing presses to India, which led to the printing presses, the first presses in Calcutta, was that he not only translated the Bible into 29 languages, but then became such a great linguist of Indian languages that he actually translated the Ramayana in Sanskrit into English, and he's a legendary figure. It's the most tragic story made more poignant, as only a journalist or a master storyteller can do, by the life of Serampore today. What it's like now. There's an encounter with a Brahmin who's converted to Christianity, a great ascetic who has been with Gandhi in the ashram in Varda, a sad man who can't reconcile his Hindu status as a born Brahmin to Christianity today, and Ian is walking along the banks of the Hooghly with his son Ravi. And Ravi says, "Did my father talk to you about his conversion to Christianity?" And Ian says, "Yes, a little bit. Tell me what he said." And Ian tries to do it as gently as possible. And he says, "But he would only tell this to an outsider." Outsiders can hear more, and people sometimes, I think, talk to outsiders more.
Well, I think that anybody who's traveled by Indian train over a long distance usually falls into conversation with somebody. This is true of foreigners. I don't know how true it is of anybody else, who will say something like, "Do you love your wife?" You think, my God, do I love my wife? And they say, "Well, do you love your wife?" He said, "Not really." So the kind of level of intimacy that's so quickly achieved in these situations is quite alarming. It's often followed by the question, it used to be, I speak of some time ago, this is not true anymore, I'm sure, often followed by the question, so you're from England, and you say, I'm from Scotland, but it doesn't matter, I accept England as where I'm from. You say, yes, I'm from England. And they say, which place did you go to? And you think, well, what do they mean? It eventually dawns on you, they mean Oxford or Cambridge. And sometimes I tell the truth. This in the old days, I would say, look, I didn't even go to a university. That strikes absolute fear and horror into their hearts. And they say, not even an MA pass? And you say, not even MA pass, BA pass. So sometimes, just to cheer everybody up, I'll say Oxford or Cambridge, depending on my spirit at the time.
Does it make spirits soar?
Well, everybody gets more interested then because they think they've met somebody important. So it's kind of a more interesting thing to have gone to Oxford and Cambridge. I didn't go to either. But the level of intimacy in these things is really quite interesting how, I'm probably only talking about men, of course. I'm not talking about women. Women don't confess things to you in trains. But men would often see you, because you have to sleep, as it were, together, one bunk above the other. So there's often these conversations used to go on for some time about wives and love and the nature of life and corruption often came into it, but usually it was more high-flown things than that.
If you are a journalist and a foreign journalist working in India, you can have two kinds of reactions, one of great welcome and another very often of a certain amount of resentment, even hostility. What do these foreign guys know? They zip in on expense accounts and run around and file these superficial, entirely strange and often made-up accounts of India. But having a byline over a very long period of time from a particular place, which Ian Jack has had out of India, or indeed having your mug on TV, can also make for very serendipitous encounters. Instead of looking for stories, sometimes the stories come looking for you. And one of the most fascinating series in this book is of profiles of eminent and unknown Indians, of which Ian Jack is an accomplished master. Among the most touching, I think, is that of the great industrial patriarch and captain of, a real mogul of the early Indian industry, G.D. Birla.
Well,
he sought you out.
He sought me out, yes. That's how flattering that thing is, yes. G.D. Birla came to London about 1978 or 79 to publish his correspondence with Gandhi in many volumes. And he wanted journalists to take note of this event, and nobody did, but I did, and I went along to see him in his suite in the Park Lane Hotel, the Grosvenor Hotel, Park Lane. And I think he was quite touched that I'd done that, and then we took a picture of him outside, and we would have run a little piece, but the paper went on strike that week, so no piece appeared. Anyway, I then went to India, and before I'd left him, he'd said, if you come to India, I'll show you many wonderful things. And I thought that was really just a piece of kind of nonsense, like saying, have a nice day, really. I didn't ever expect to see G.D. Birla again. But I was staying in the Great Eastern Hotel in Calcutta, and suddenly I came back from a walk in town, and the whole staff were in great excitement, saying, Mr. G.D. Birla wants to be in touch with you. And he somehow found me there. So I went to see him in Delhi. He put a Dakota at my disposal to engineer a plane. He showed me various factories, all of which was interesting. Then he put 2 ambassador cars, which he himself made. I mean, not he himself, his company made. And he had 2 because one might break down, which was sensible. And they drove me to Pilani, where he had this wonderful university, where I was made to do the most ridiculous things, really. I was treated like, I don't know, Prince Charles or Albert Einstein or somebody, in which I was made to salute the assembled students who dashed past me, running or jogging or walking or marching from a kind of saluting podium, a bit like that. So I somehow coped with all this, and then I got to know him reasonably well. I mean, he was quite confiding in me, and he had very fierce opinions. I once asked him, he misunderstood the question. I said, what would India be like, do you think, if Gandhi hadn't been shot in your garden? And he understood me to have said, what did I think Gandhi would have been like had he not been shot in your garden? And his reply was, he'd be an interfering old man. Now that seemed to me astonishingly frank. I mean, there was no kind of sanctifying of Gandhi at all. And then I asked him about, I think it was Moraji Desai's son, Kanti Desai, what was he like? And he said, stupid. And then I asked him about Sanjay, and he said, wicked and stupid. And then his son, K.K. Birla, kind of tugged him like this, and he said, no, Papa, no more. Because he was then going on to describe Mrs. Gandhi. But I can't remember what he said about Mrs. Gandhi, so we won't go there. But he was an amazingly kind of bullish guy. And the odd thing, one of the odd things about him, really, for somebody so sophisticated and so clever, he was a very clever man, I thought, Birla. But when he would turn up at the Grosvenor House Hotel in London, which he'd had a suite in since the 1930s, I think, with his staff, all of whom were from the same bit of, all of whom were Marwaris, really, he would turn up with quite an entourage, and the entourage would all eat. I went with them to the coffee house one day, and they were all eating chips and peas, because they were vegetarians. And I said, but you don't have to eat chips and peas. They said, well, what else can we eat? I said, well, there's these thing called avocado pears. They said, oh. I said, let's have an avocado pear. So they said, jolly good, these avocado pears. So I did a small change in the Birla diet there.
Well, that's just one of many, many extraordinary encounters of remarkable Indians. You'll read them all. Ian has known them and written about them, from the Gandhi family, Indira and Rajiv, to Bhagwan Rajneesh, for example, the great publisher, the Indian hero of Western publishing, Sunny Mehta. Also, unknown Indians, the great eccentric collector and bibliophile R.P. Gupta in Kolkata, or the revered editor, the literary editor, the great man of letters of the Times of India for many years, Shamlal, whose tenant or lodger Ian was in Delhi.
No, I was Shamlal's PG. I don't know if Shamlal means anything to people. I suspect it does. He was a very clever...
Well, there's some nods here.
He was a very clever, learned, wise person who'd been the editor of the Times of India for a long time. And he was intensely shy. Intensely shy. And actually what he did as an editor, it seemed to me, was that he wasn't the kind of chief executive of the editorial department. He wrote interesting pieces, often about the arts, often about politics, and he wrote leaders, but he didn't have much kind of, what I gather in this festival is called face-to-face interaction with his staff.
He didn't have Facebook for sure.
No, he didn't have Facebook, that's very true. So much so that he would often ask who people were in his office. He once asked who the news editor was. Who's that chap? It's the news editor, Mr. Shamlal. Oh, right. But I knew him as he was a splendid landlord. I couldn't have asked for a better landlord. And I now sympathize with what he used to say, because he still wrote a column for the Telegraph in those days, and it was once a week. And every Thursday night, he would plod up the stairs to his own study, past my bedroom, and he would say, what is there to say? There's nothing new to say. I hate writing. And he would sit there and scratch away with his fountain pen, which then a courier would pick up in the morning and take to the only person in India who could understand his scribbling, which was Mr. Banerjee at the Times of India office. And I've come to see, actually, how hateful writing can be, because he'd been doing it a long, long time. And eventually, I mean, I kind of agree with him in a way, What is there to say?
There's a lot to say and there's a lot to hear. But the 2 points that Ian is making, I think, is the inherent value or necessity, its obvious immediacy of journalism. What journalism or remembering people or exploring stories does is that it freezes time for us. And yet, time can't be held because it's changing. So journalism is also about observing change. There's another problem with journalism, which reporters like him and I face, and that is occasionally having to meet the famous and being immediately contradicted. You've heard that a famous quote every day from a politician or a famous person saying, "Oh, I didn't say that, I've been misquoted." And one of the profiles here is of the late, and in my opinion, great novelist Ruth Praver Jhabwala, who died this year. She was very celebrated in her time. She was a Polish Jew by birth, who had fled Nazi Germany to Britain, married a great Parsi architect, come to settle in Delhi, later went on to win the Booker Prize, the Oscar for her famous screenplays, but she was a famously, notoriously retiring woman with a very complex relationship with India. A love-hate relationship with India. She rarely gave interviews. The one interview she gave was to Ian Jack in the Sunday Times magazine, which is reported here. You got into trouble with her, didn't you?
Well, yes. I mean, I suppose I quoted her accurately, and can we stop that buzzing? Is it? Anyway, I mean, the truth about Ruth Kaur Jhabwala, it seemed to me then, was that she hated India, and she said as much, really. She'd spent a lot of her time, a lot of her life here trying to like it, and she hadn't liked it, and she'd not succeeded, really, in trying to be Indian. All of which are perfectly understandable, not to be criticized for them. But when the piece was published, she, of course, was very upset, saying she'd eaten these people's salt, in her phrase, and she didn't want to be thought of as somebody who hated it. But I think, so that's Ruth Kaur Jhabwala, but I think that a much greater difficulty, I think, for reporting in this country, if you're a foreigner, really, is this, that, and I used to feel this intensely and feel completely defeated by it. If you write about a by-election in, say, well, I don't know, anywhere in India, actually.
Karnataka. They've just had one.
Karnataka. And you write about a by-election, you don't have much time to write about it, and you end up using the same words, polling booth, vote, lawn, tent, village, that they have completely different contextual meanings in two countries. The word village in England to the English person, the British person, suggests a clock tower, a pond, an inn, a stagecoach, a Christmas card, Charles Dickens, say. The word village in India doesn't suggest those things. The word village in India is like the word village in 18th century Europe. The word village in 18th century Europe meant somewhere you'd be very lucky to get out of and be somewhere else in a town. And that kind of difference, it's an interesting thing in language, that kind of difference is something you could never make obvious in reporting. I mean, reporting's too quick for that kind of thing. You need to get it down, as you know. And if you're a slow writer like I am, you spend all night staying up in some much less nice hotel than the Crown Plaza.
The Hotel Republic in Patna.
Yeah, you might be in the Hotel Republic in Patna. And you would write this piece, and often it would seem entirely inadequate to the subject it described. But I guess that is journalism, really. I mean, that is what journalism is. It's a kind of instant thing. I was reasonably good at it. Perhaps sometimes, I think, I was reading this book again this morning in preparation for this, and I caught myself thinking, oh, this isn't too bad. Which was a refreshing thing to find myself thinking.
It's very, very good.
And it's had very generous reviews here. People would be very nice about it. But the other thing, of course, is that when I edited Grant, I was always struck by the difference that people try to make between writing and journalism. I'm not sure there is a difference. Good reporting can be writing. Bad writing can be just bad writing. I think that, Professor Carey at Oxford University, where I didn't go, made a very good point when he said that the novel, the fiction of the novel, had a kind of attracted lots of attention because people had an almost kind of primitive attitude to it as a piece of magic, as a confection, an invention, whereas non-fiction had never attracted that kind of mystique. But it seems to me there's some very, very good non-fiction written, including some very good reporting. And I think it's probably not had the status it might have had.
I'm not sure I agree with that.
You can disagree.
What non-fiction or journalism of whatever quality does, as I said earlier, it freezes time. It leaves us at its most rudimentary a record. May I tell a recent anecdote with your permission of how important this is?
I'm entirely in your hands.
I was recording a long interview with the novelist Amitav Ghosh just a few days ago in Delhi. And one of the questions that strikes me again and again about Amitabh's many wonderful novels, The Hungry Tides, Sea of Poppies, River of Smoke, is that so many of them are set along rivers. The Ganges in Bihar, in Bengal, the Ganges Delta, the life of the Indian Ocean now and in the 19th century. And I said, was this a conscious choice? And he said, yes, because to his mind, novelists, fiction writers are under a moral obligation, I'm not sure I agree, to point at some of the most pressing issues of their time, in this case, environment. And he lamented deeply the decline of India's waterways. Can one make the journey from Calcutta to Allahabad anymore? What happened to the Goa-Bombay ferry services? Do they ply anymore? Our deltas are silted up, our rivers are polluted sewers, and so on. So I took all the impassioned sentences down. They seemed to me brilliant, and I had to file a column that night. And for the life of me, I couldn't find anything, any appropriate quote quickly enough to endorse Amitav Ghosh's opinion. I looked around in my library and I suddenly found a brilliant set of 19th century letters by the great Emily Eden. Emily Eden was the sister of Lord Auckland in Calcutta, then Governor General, a sharp-eyed spinster who was also acted as his hostess. And in 1937, she sailed with her brother in a barge commanding 140 minions from Calcutta to Benares. Every day she wrote a letter. She wasn't a journalist. But those copious, brilliant letters of life upstream, sailing from Calcutta to Benares, have never gone out of print. They're still available in a remarkable book called Up the Country. So the Daily Dispatchian.
Well, as you mentioned Amitav Ghosh, I will tell you why my wife will never ever read a book by him. In one of his books, one of his novels, he describes the character leaving Scotland and seeing the hills orange with heather. Well, as we all know, those of us who come from there, hills might be white with heather, or they might be purple with heather, but they are never orange with heather. On such fine points of literary criticism do novels fall in our household. As for the observer and the observed, or the witness, I mean, that's what journalism should be. It should be a witness to things. Oddly enough, I have traveled quite a bit on Indian rivers, or at least on Indian Bangladeshi rivers, Bengali rivers, and I've enjoyed it very much. In fact, Barishal, which very few people seem to go to, perhaps wisely, which is the Venice of Bengal, is a charming place which you used to be able to reach in a very charming way by steamer from Dhaka, I gather. from somebody I met today, that's no longer possible, but it was a very nice thing to do. But that whole riverine system in India has atrophied, it's decayed, which is a great shame. But partition really finished that off, I think.
Absolutely, and the partition of India reminds me of another small story which has to do with this business of being an outsider in India. Who is an outsider and who is an insider, and how these two positions and perceptions also changed through history. Not long ago, my wife and I were in Lahore, where we found ourselves unhappily marooned for a few days because of a strike by Pakistan Airways, and it took days to get our air exit converted into a land crossing. And one morning, my wife said, "Do you know who's buried in Lahore? Do you know Jahangir and his beautiful empress Noor Jahan are buried here?" I said, "Yes, of course, you are right. That's the reason you love people and even marry them." So one morning at 6 o'clock, we went across the river Ravi to Shadara, which means Shah Ka Dera, the place of the kings, to watch, to see these two great mausoleums. And my wife was in tears. We were very saddened to observe that Noor Jahan's superb tomb was virtually in ruins. But what was visible with the exquisite beauty of this architecture was that it was entirely Persian. And then, of course, I remembered that she was, of course, a foreigner. She was Persian. She brought all the great taste to Agra. The Madhud-Dola, Mumtaz Mahal was a niece, don't forget, and her besotted husband. But they hated her at court because she was a foreigner till the end. And that evening we were with Pakistani friends, learned liberals, and my wife was very angry and said, "How can you do this to the great Mughal empress? Her dying garden and the amnesty she sought to live the last 15 years of her life here." And they said, "We are very sad too, but Pakistanis, our government thinks of her as Indian." So who's a foreigner? Who's an Indian? Frontiers change, but people leave their records and their footprints. And Ian Jack, I'm deeply grateful to you.
I'm a foreigner, by the way.
Who tells us more about Indian than many Indians do. We'll take questions.
What am I writing next? Sorry, I'll take this question because I can hear it in the front. Well, I'll tell you what I'm supposed to be writing next. I'm supposed to be writing a book about the River Clyde, talking about rivers. The River Clyde in Scotland, which is... Is better? Yeah. But of course I'm not doing it. I've taken a little money from the publisher. I feel guilty every week. My guilt deepens. But I keep having to earn money through writing columns for The Guardian, so it's quite difficult. But I will get down to it. But that's what I'm trying to do. I've written a proposal, but I haven't written the book.
So I'll just ask you a question. Do you think writing a novel, is it asthmatic? You take some scene in and you go back and scribble, or just asking you.
I can't hear that, sorry.
I'm asking you, is it traveling on, like you said, Patna and all that? I said, is it asthmatic? You get all the polluted in, then you go refresh yourself and come back, write something?
I'm sorry, I'm really sorry. I can't follow that. I'm sorry.
No, I'm not saying, I'm just asking you a question. But no.
Yeah, yes.
Does it affect your breathing that you go into a fair practice of writing everywhere, wherever you go, or you go back to your place with your imaginations and then write a story?
Does traveling restock my mind and my imagination? Is that, have I understood the question properly? Yeah? Well, yes, it does. In fact, I was getting kind of desperate before I came here because I was running out of things to describe. And quite often that happens, that you feel you need to do something else or go somewhere else or meet somebody else so you can write about it. I mean, that's a very common thing. Sorry, here's another question.
Ian, I have a question here. Yeah, here in the second pendal.
Yeah?
It's very fascinating the way you have looked at our country in a way that many of us Indians don't get to see, even if we are journalists. My question is, as a foreign correspondent, sometimes you're celebrated here, given special treatment like that car ride with Morarji Desai. But how were you looked at by your own peers in your home country? What were they, I mean, did they look at you as, with a lot of pity and sympathy that, oh, you poor guy, you get to go to that country and cover? Or was this with a sense of awe, how you covered that country at all?
I'm going to answer a slightly different question, perhaps, but it's a lie to it. Journalists here won't perhaps believe this, but journalism here is accorded a kind of respect that isn't true of Britain. A journalist in Britain is somewhat up from a politician in levels of public esteem. Journalism is not thought to be a wonderful thing to do in Britain. Its reputation here is more elevated than that. There's such different places, really. People would sometimes say to me who came from India in the 70s and 80s, could I talk to the Home Office to sort something out? Well, of course, I couldn't talk to the Home Office. I mean, I don't know anybody in the Home Office. There's bureaucracy there. I couldn't rely on old friendships to talk to the Home Office. It'd be impossible for me. But it would, and so they were often disappointed and rather fed up because they had helped me in South Block, say, in Delhi. And that's because two different ways of doing things apply. But as for my colleagues, they were envious. I think most journalists, the idea that Delhi is a hardship posting, as it used to be called, in foreign embassies, is absolutely absurd. For a diplomat to say it's really hard to live there. Nonsense, it's not. It's terribly easy. You've got servants for a start. You'll rarely get servants anywhere in Europe. And for journalism too, it's a delightful place to be. So I think envy rather than anything else is the reaction of my going to India.
I just wanted to ask you, Ian, that you have been writing about India since the 70s. Could you tell us a little bit, could you share with us how the writing about India has changed in the British press over the past 30, 40 years? What is the tone of change?
The writing in the British press?
Yes, about India.
Well, I think it's much better than it was when I was doing it, to be honest with you. I mean, I think that there's a guy called Jason Burke who writes in The Guardian. I've never met him, I don't know him. But the kind of variety he packs into his week, in which he writes about politics or about Bollywood or about this and that, is he's a tremendously energetic reporter. And I think people in Britain now have a much better idea of what India is like than they had in the 70s. I mean, if you think visually, we just know so much more about it now. Thanks to films, thanks to documentaries. I mean, the kind of documentary that the BBC have now, there was a series on kind of scams and ways of earning a living in Mumbai and Calcutta. Yes. It was a brilliant thing. And it gave you a kind of insight into life here that people like me could never give you. You know, you needed insight and insider information. So I think the standard of journalism, when it applies to India, in Britain, is much, much higher than it was, I think.
One last question.
Yes, sir.
One last question.
You have to shout or come to the front, even.
All right.
We'll repeat. Yeah, you asked him there. We'll repeat it.
One last.
Oh, right.
What's your question?
So the question is, how different is the kind of industrial elite now to it was then? how different is Ambani to Birla in a way, is the question. Would that be a fair way of summing it up? Well, I've never really met Mr. Ambani, so I can't properly answer it. But I suspect that Birla was a much more careful, and I hesitate to use the word humble because he probably wasn't humble, but he certainly didn't, he was not a flashy person. He wouldn't have built himself a 35-story house in Mumbai, although he had a very nice house in Amrita Shergill Marg in Delhi. And one delightful thing about having lunch there was he had these delicious carrots that were stuffed with currants. I always remember. So there must have been somebody in the kitchen putting currants into carrots, which suggests some wealth and some taste, perhaps. But I think that, Birla was concerned not to be flashy. I asked him once about Tata. I said, what do you think of Tata? What do you think of Mr. Tata? He said, all he thinks about is rupees, as though he didn't think about rupees. But there we are.
Ian, thank you very much. And will you give Ian Jack a big hand? Thank you for coming. And please go and buy Mufassil Encounters. He's signing the book.